Just hopefully informative, interesting story if it is something that you and your agency are embarking on, or as Melissa said, maybe you start embarking on it next year and you can come back to this video and listen. So first, in the kin-specific model standards, so maybe everybody knows about them, but just for context, when the feds finalized the rule allowing agencies to choose to have a kin-specific foster home licensing or approval process, the federal requirement is pretty light on details. You have to do some particular background checks, and then you have to be reasonably in accordance with the recommendations of national organizations. And so many of us on this call got together as national organizations and with almost every agency in the country and over 100 kinship caregivers to design model standards for what it looks like to have an inclusive, safe licensing or approval process for relatives. And as part of that, we co-designed the definition of relative that we think is inclusive and clear. That's the hope. We try to get a lot of feedback. And frankly, we looked at every single agency's definitions today and pulled this together in consultation with NICWA and with others as well. So the definition, I won't really read slides, but I will say this out loud. The model definition of relative is individuals related to a child by blood, marriage, tribal custom, and/or adoption, and other individuals who have an emotionally significant relationship with the child or the child's parents or other family members, often referred to as fictive kin. And we included that extension to make it clear that so-called fictive kin might be somebody that knows the child, like the child's teacher or godparents or an auntie or an uncle who maybe is not legally or biologically an auntie or an uncle, someone that's trusted by the child's parents, particularly when you have a young child who doesn't necessarily have their own relationships with people, right? And then other family members, because we heard many scenarios where there are siblings and one of those siblings, godparents or best friend's mom is willing to take that child. And they're also willing to take all the siblings, even though one of the siblings may not necessarily have that relationship with that caregiver. So that was kind of where that came from. And then really important to notice that this definition should not be construed to affect what an extended family member is in the Indian Child Welfare Act. So I want to make sure that's on everybody's radar. If you are in the process of updating your definition, you hopefully don't need to do all the research of what every other agency is doing, and you could take this definition. It's also useful to look at your own definition and compare it to this. If your literal words are not the same, but the spirit is the same and all the same people are included, then it may be fine as is. So again, like who's included in the model definition, thinking through if you're looking at your own definition, is it inclusive or not? This is just an example list of people, but you want relatives of any degree. I know a bunch of agencies have like to the 3rd degree or to the 5th degree of sanguinity, that word that I can never pronounce. We want relatives of any degree, godparents, neighbors, teachers, your siblings' kin, and then fictive kin, which I keep using scare quotes because people don't necessarily respond well to being described as fictive kin, right? Kin is kin. And so that term is falling a bit out of favor, but it tends to be a term of art in our space. Manoush, I'd love for you to come on and share what you're developing in New Jersey to help staff determine if someone is kin or not by your definition.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, I know Marina and I had a conversation about this, that in our state, our definition really was about having a positive psychological or emotional relationship to be included as kin. And so in practice, we were trying to be very inclusive. But what was coming up a lot of times for staff was they felt that there wasn't a lot of guidance to ensure consistency, right, in how that definition was being applied. And so, we're looking at our policies to include some factors to consider in that assessment process. Our definitions are also tied to some, statutes. So I don't know if we'd be able to change the definition in the immediate future, but I think just that significant piece, I think, is helpful. And we are missing that piece, right? Because I could have a positive relationship with anybody who's an acquaintance, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's significant, or a family-like relationship, which I've seen other states include in their definition. So really, we're looking to kind of add that nuance in our policy, but still be expansive and inclusive, right? And we have sort of like a draft right now of guidance. We were hoping to maybe develop almost like a decision tree. We have something like that for our investigative findings. So, I think that's helpful for staff to kind of like follow an order of things, right? A structure, something systematic, to help with some of those concerns about consistency and how we're looking at it. But really, what we realized, in the work that we do in this space, we work a lot in the gray, right? So, staff like to have that yes or no, give me the buckets, tell me who fits in this bucket and who fits in this bucket. And so, when we asked for feedback on the draft, a lot of the comments we got really came down to people just wanting us to give them the answer. And so that's not what we're looking to do, because it's going to have the opposite effect of being inclusive and expansive, right? Because we don't want to be prescriptive in only these people can be, or can the hairdresser be fictive kin? Well, it depends, right? Like, my hairdresser is not, but in some communities, in some cultures, right? For certain families, and it really, for me, I think it comes down to who is the family identifying, right? Who is the family identifying? It's not really for us to determine who is or who isn't. But then once we have those significant people in their lives identified, then we can also look at these other factors around, you know, the the kind of like the depth of that relationship, how all of the different parties feel, right? Whether it's the parents or caregivers of origin, the children, how do they feel about this particular person? What's their comfort level? And then doing that assessment piece. So, like, first looking at who's the family identifying, and then moving to, now doing almost like a best interest determination. If you have multiple people, how do we determine who's really best suited to meet the needs of this child or these particular children? What does that look like in terms of support, maintaining those connections to their community, to their religion, to all of those things that we know that contribute to that sense of belonging and identity, and just really helping with that feeling of consistency, stability, and not losing those important pieces of yourself, right? When you have to be separated from your family. So that's kind of where we are. We have sort of a list of questions that we want staff to consider, but again, it's in draft format still. And we were hoping that maybe the work group could help us, the working group could kind of help us maybe develop some sort of a decision tree for staff, because again, I do think that would be helpful as well. Did you have any specific questions I could answer, Marina, or thoughts?
So I think like we are very interested in helping develop this tool together. It sounds like, I mean, you've made a lot of headway. My first question for the overall group, and it's fine to email this later if you think of it, but I'm curious who else, if anyone, has such a tool. Is there a decision tree or a guidance document that you've developed? And it might be, sometimes these tools aren't necessarily formal from the agency, but it's the workers have developed it amongst themselves to kind of train new workers, right? Or to help maintain consistency across their team. So my first call out is just, we are looking for anybody that has examples of this now. Yes, Melissa dropped her email in the chat, so you could message it to Melissa. And then second to that, if you don't have such a tool, but you are interested in co-designing one and iterating on what Manoush has already developed, we would love to help facilitate that. And that could range from, maybe spending an hour with you and your team to go through it and give feedback so far, or even just, you can, we'll make sure to have a meeting about it once we have developed a first go at it, to get further feedback from you, or so that you can see it. So Manoush, so count us in. We're going to help you with that. And so when your draft is ready, You can share it. If other folks have it, then I'll share that back with Manoush too, and we can look at all the different examples that are out there. And then we can iteratively improve on it like we were with all the other model standard forms, right? Where we were testing it with people that are really using it, going through different scenarios and seeing, are there sometimes even a little tweak, like making a few words clearer, can help think through. And to Manoush's point, which I thought was really great, the goal here isn't to have an exhaustive list of every possible relationship and then you check the box and it moves ahead. It's to help maintain the consistency across your staff and across your team, and especially probably for a new worker, right, or a new to the role worker, helping them feel confident in their decision without us going so far as to say that, you know, everybody is kin now and there's nobody that's not kin, when that's probably not really realistic. So thank you for sharing. Thank you, frankly, for doing all this work on the tool. And again, if anybody out there has a tool, again, it can be handwritten, it could be a flowchart on your wall. It doesn't have to be anything formal. We would love to see it. And or if you'd like to be involved in co-designing and building on what Manoush has built in New Jersey, send a message to Melissa and we'll get you looped in. All right, next up is Anna. Anna, I'm happy to run slides here if you want to. Anna is going to share with us a bit about like the flexibility that you have in defining relative, because she is the world expert in this.
Thank you, Marina. Well, I will say I've been doing this work for a very long time, and I am a lawyer by training. So I have delved in many state codes, in the federal code, et cetera, et cetera. And right out of the box, I want to tell you all that many states do have a separate definition of relative for different purposes. The feds, for child welfare law purposes, and policy purposes, leave it up to you to define relative as you see fit. And that's usually the term is relative that you'll see in federal law and policy. That's what's referenced typically is relative. So, so there's a great deal of flexibility in how you define that term, and where you define that term. And, you know, sometimes it can be overwhelming if you have this huge definition like we are proposing for the kin-specific licensing standards. And you think, good Lord, I've got to identify and notify all these people, because that's what another federal law says, that you've got to identify and notify all adult relatives. And if you define relatives to be super broad, how does this work? So know that you've identified relative for that purpose more narrowly, or you can have different tiers. You can say, we're notifying all adult blood relatives. We're going to identify and notify up to 3 victive, you know, or non-related relatives. You really do have tremendous flexibility when it comes to how you define that term, where you define it, etc. But you do want to be mindful of conflicting definitions working across the span of the case. So what I've seen in working with jurisdictions is, for example, a very narrow definition of emergency or provisional placement, which hopefully will be less of a thing now that we've got kin-specific, but it's still a thing. So a kind of a broad definition of relative for purposes of emergency or provisional, and then that relative may stay in that status for, say, 6 months, and the child could exit to federal guardianship under that status. However, the guardianship is defined more narrowly. So then they're up against a wall and they're like, oh, wait, I can't qualify for, and we can't exit with guardianship and federally funded guardianship, because I don't fall under the definition that the state has got for relative for purposes of guardianship assistance. So that's just an example that you want to be mindful of how your definition impacts across the life of the case. I hate to use that language, but the life of the family involved in child welfare and their exit out of child welfare. But these are places where relative is typically found, used by states and tribes and territories. So that emergency provisional, the kin-specific, and in the interim, the non-safety related waivers and variances that you all are allowed to do for relatives or kin. So how you define that there is very important. The identification and notification, like we talked about, that can be a different definition. Child-only TANF is defined, relative is defined by each jurisdiction for that purpose as well. And only 8 or 9 include, again, for lack of a better phrase or quicker phrase, victive kin, but some do. And I will share a spreadsheet in the chat where you can look at what it's a few years old, so it may not be up to date. And if you see your state's wrong, let me know. But where states have defined relatives for purposes of TANF, because that's still such an important support for so many families. And these other places. So you really want to be thoughtful about how you do it, but you can do it differently. And I want to elevate one last thing about definitions, which is the definition of sibling. So you are not required under federal law to define sibling, but you are required to, by federal law, to include in that definition and how you think of siblings, and it doesn't have to be in writing, but you do have to think of them, right? That it includes children who under state law would be considered a sibling, but their parental rights were terminated. I mean, their parents' parental rights were terminated, or their parent died. But if those things hadn't happened, they would be siblings. And so because those things have happened, they're still considered siblings. And that's a federal requirement. And that was a lot of words, and I will drop it in the chat. But know that also that the definition of sibling can have impacts across the board, and who you notify, who you identify in guardianship assistance. So just want to elevate that real quickly. Thank you, Marina.
No, thank you, Anna. So Stacy asked in the chat if you can talk, and you sort of touched on this, but maybe you could say a few more words. Can you talk about other impacts of expanding who is a relative? For example, the requirements for diligent search.
Yeah, so it can impact that. So that's why you want to be thoughtful of how you define that relative for the purposes of identification and notification, which is where the diligent search would come in. So, just think about what makes sense for the child and the family and your caseworkers. Because, if you just have one definition and it includes all these people, that could be incredibly burdensome.
Yeah. And is it fair to say for things like diligent search, if the parents have said, hey, grandma is available, grandma's a placement, then that doesn't necessarily mean you then also need to go out to the baseball coach. But if there's no one between here and the baseball coach, then you do want to lean in, lean out, I guess, on the expansive definition.
Super important point, Marina. And something that you can also put in policy. Yeah, that you look first perhaps for the obvious blood relatives or relatives by marriage or adoption. And then if that's not possible, you move to the next phase. So you really do have tremendous flexibility.
I'm curious from the audience first, if anybody has questions for Anna, please put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand. But I'm also curious if anyone sees an example that is missing from this list, because we are hoping to make ultimately a comprehensive one, so that if you are updating your definition, you can use it as a cheat sheet to go through and be like, okay, it's going to apply to emergency placement. It's going to apply to kin-specific licensing. But like Anna just said, it's not necessarily going to apply for notification that child entered care, or it will, but in this tiered way, where we're going to start with more immediate relatives. And only if they aren't available will we kind of move out. Kim says she's a little confused about the sibling connection. Can you maybe explain that, Anna?
It's confusing. That's why. And I think I didn't explain it great. But so if so you need to you obviously have a definition of sibling, whether it's in writing or not. And sibling impacts, for example, identifying and notifying adult relatives, right? Because the relative might be an adult sibling. I mean, you're not going to notify a 10-year-old sibling to be the caregiver of this child or the placement of this child, but a 20-year-old you're going to want to do. So how you define sibling matters for that. And then it matters down the line, because here's a really important example, guardianship assistance. So under federal guardianship assistance, siblings in the home of otherwise eligible children for federal ongoing guardianship assistance. So the child is 4E eligible and otherwise eligible. If they have siblings in that home with grandma or come into that home with grandma, those siblings can also get the guardianship assistance, even though they're not considered 4E children because they were removed from a different home, maybe a different parent who didn't meet those poverty guidelines. So how you define sibling is important, and being inclusive is important for all these reasons, for the identification, for the guardianship. And I will drop in the language from federal law of the termination business, because that it's hard to talk about, but I think once you read it, it'll be easier. It's basically just saying that siblings are siblings, regardless of what happened to their parent. Does that make sense?
It sounds like Michigan appeals court thought differently about the adoption, that if a sibling was adopted out, that they don't count anymore. So maybe Jessica, you should hit the network up for some technical assistance, and Anna can help parse that against the federal law.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great, but that's come up repeatedly, you know, when we've reached out to our legal team, and they've made it very clear based on the Wilson v. King ruling. I think I put it in there 2012 that they determined that it severed that relationship with adoption. So yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks, Marina.
Yeah, great. Okay, any other questions for Anna? I saw Stacy was looking for an example of policy, so we'll find that for you, Stacy, and share.
You know, it's a little tricky to do because there's so many different places. But yeah, we can
Awesome.
help.
Oh, Evelyn, I see your hand up. Sorry about that. Missed you.
No, it's okay. So I had a question. At some point, if a non-relative has adopted a sibling group and another sibling comes into care, would they be considered kin? Could that fall into the definition? And then my other question was, with the definition for siblings, if you have two parents who have kids with different from previous relationships, but they're all raised in the same house, but they have no blood relation, would that fall under sibling also, because they're raised by these two parents, even if there's not that blood connection? I don't know.
That's all up. Yeah, that's all up to your state, Evelyn. So definitely we encourage, you know, that half siblings, step siblings, but it's really completely, the feds give total flexibility to the communities on how and who they consider siblings. But I do think it's best practice to put it in writing so that you don't have one caseworker thinking these two are siblings and another caseworker thinking they're not, because that's not fair.
Yeah, and maybe those are the kinds of examples that would be helpful in like Manoush's tool, where it's not super prescriptive, but it does say like this is allowed, which might help with some of the consistency. Stacy?
I just wanted to clarify, and I wanted to make sure I heard you right. So you're saying that it's allowable within a state's policy to define relative in terms of emergency placement and doing that diligent search for relative, but still including more kinship, traditional kinship definitions in that definition of relative, as long as it's defined. You start with this group and then you move out to this group. Did I hear that right?
You know, I do. Yes, you did. And I don't know that I have an example to point to of a state that has done that, but it would be fully permissible under federal law, and they would have to approve it anyway as part of your 4E plan. But I have heard of states, you know, having prescribing how many of those victims can they notify. I don't know that I've seen it. Maureen, have you seen it in tiers?
I see a policy in my head, but I don't want to say it out loud in case I'm misremembering it from a state, but I will go and bring it up. I think I have in it, that would be more in your practice. So like your definition may still be just as comprehensive, but in your practice for diligent search, you'd say what Anna is saying, like first tier is more like the people that the parents have identified, for example, would probably be a tier 1. And so it might even be that your tiers are not immediate relatives and then expanding out by degree of relative, but it's about degree of relationship or degree of how the parents feel about then the child, if the child is old enough to have preferences.
Right. And that makes sense. And I appreciate that. That's been one of our barriers, is just the implications of that. And if they, if they didn't tell us, like you said, identify and then later do, but that makes total sense. And if there is anything, that would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll get you an example.
Let's look. And then Alicia was sharing some useful stuff from Oregon that is worth looking at in the chat, and we'll make sure to share out
Yeah.
as well. Any other questions for Anna? Anna, that was extremely helpful. Thank you. Because those are the kind of questions I hear a lot is, don't we have to have one definition for all things, or can we tier our approach? Like, does the baseball coach have the exact same standing as grandma that's, been living next door? Not necessarily, like it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah.
Great.
Excellent.
Okay. Amber.
Thank you, Marina.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Anna, so much. Amber, I would love it if you could share a bit, because you have some great stories here around the impact of how you define relative on the ICPC process. Did we lose Amber?
I am here. It just took me a minute to find my mute button.
Oh,
So
good. It hides. Yeah.
yes. So so actually recently we just had a discussion about an issue that come up regarding this issue. So Oklahoma actually has separate definitions for relative and kins, statutorily separate definitions for relative and kin. And our kinship definition is very broad to include anyone that the family identifies as a significant person in their life and things like that. So we like that here, and we operate under that pretense for ICPC purposes when we see something come into our state requesting a relative study. So when we, as a receiving state, have something come in that says, I want an ICPC relative request, we say, well, we're going to, if our state has a broad definition of kinship and it's, the coach, then we're going to accept that as kinship here. And so as we're moving into implementing model standards for our state, we're very excited to see the impact on ICPC timeliness for placement decisions returned to other states, because this is just what we've been waiting on all this time, because like many other states, we have to have our relatives go through the same process right now. This changes the game. And so we want to make sure that it changes the game for our ICPC folks as well. And so one thing that we have always done here in Oklahoma that's worked well for us is make sure that whenever decisions are made that impact foster care and adoption programs in general, we want to make sure that those processes align with ICPC. And so if something is going to change, they are assessing relatives, we want to make sure that that change is cohesive across the board for ICPC. And so when we heard about kinship model standards, we're like, this is the answer to ICPC. If we could get everyone on board, it would alleviate the need for border agreements, because basically it becomes an expedited way to place children across the nation, the same way that we hoped to achieve that through border agreements historically. So, I mean, it's definitely a game changer. And so we run into problems, though, because there are states that, just like Michigan just referenced, that post-termination, biological relatives are no longer relatives by the way that states define that final action of terminating rights. And so any prior existing biological family is no longer seen as family. And so when we go to send an ICPC request on a grandma that her son's parental rights have been terminated to a certain state that has those kind of rules in place, they say, sorry, this grandma is not seen as a relative. And we're actually dealing with a state that has model kin in place, but doesn't see terminated relatives as meeting definition of kinship. So it's really interesting to see how this is going to play out moving forward. Of course, the theory is our jobs have gotten a lot harder over the last 20 years as far as children's needs and being able to find appropriate placements to serve them. The world's social problems are much more challenging. And if you guys are in the same boat as Oklahoma, we need to expand our options for our kids, not limit them. And we really kind of need to look at overall philosophies and challenge our folks in the right places, whether that's legislatively or within our own agency's policies. Do we have contradictory philosophies going on where we no longer see people as relatives if there's been TPR, but we know as social workers that is still relatives and those are still kinship options? And if we're calling coaches and church members kinships, then so is grandma that was grandma, and a piece of paper terminating rights doesn't change that. And so I'm also interested to hear how model kinship standards might impact looking at terminated parents and how states are going to respond to that. I'm thinking through that myself, and what type of assessment are we going to use here in Oklahoma when another state approaches us to assess a terminated parent for their children, because we get requests frequently from our caseworkers saying, hey, we've got a terminated parent living in this state. Do you think that state will help us out in assessing them to see if things are different now? Here in Oklahoma, we want to find a way to do that for states that have parents in those situations. And we would challenge other states to do the same thing, because our kids deserve that, and people do change. If we don't believe that, we're in the wrong profession. You know, I'm definitely not the same person I was 10 years ago. I'm sure none of you all are either. So it's like, this alone just opens up the door for so many other conversations that really challenge us as an agency to look at those philosophies that are really kind of going, what are we doing here? And we really want to make, this is the right time to get things aligned, to get things done right for our kids in an expedited way with the support of federal funding. And so I'm so excited for Marina and her team and Anna and all of the work that they've done. So, woohoo. Yeah.
Thank you, Amber. That was super inspirational. And I also feel like when you first told me that story, I hadn't honestly even really thought very much about the impact of defining relative on ICPC. And then just to underscore something that you said, because I think not everybody understands this. If you're asking another state for ICPC, it's that state's definition of kin that what counts, whether not your definition, even though you're the one asking. So I think
Right.
that you know, now is definitely surfacing some inconsistencies. And your story of considering parents with terminated parental rights, like they sure seem like kin to me. And I have also seen stories where I think there was one I would have bet my house that they never would have been in contact, and parental rights have been restored and everybody is thriving. So you just never know, and you have to have hope.
Yeah, we want to at least give them a fair shake. And there's nothing wrong, in my mind, there's nothing wrong with assessing a situation. And model kin gives us a lot of flexibilities to do that still in a safe way. So it's just the right time to look at things, I think.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you, Amber, so much for sharing. I appreciate that. And hopefully it was thought-provoking as other folks are looking at their definition for purposes of ICPC and beyond. Okay, with that, I'm going to move to, we've got a couple of stories, and I'm going to start with Jessica from Michigan to share what it was like when Michigan updated their definition in 2022. So Jessica, passing it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Marina. So I kind of just outlined all the steps that we took, and hopefully some of these will be helpful to you as you think about your own state statutes. But we actually started the process of updating our statutory definitions of relative and related back in 2019. So when we first started looking at doing these updates, we reviewed other states' language, and we were really looking at ideas on how they had incorporated these fictive kin relationships into their statutes. So what we found is that some states had fictive kin as their own definitions, and other states had really incorporated those fictive relationships to be embedded within their definition. So after doing those reviews, we drafted some proposed language. And I will tell you that there were three reasons that at the time, there were three reasons that pushed us to incorporate those fictive relationships into our existing definition of a relative, instead of making a separate fictive kin definition. And the reasons for that, one, Michigan is under a federal lawsuit, and unfortunately, we continue to be under the lawsuit. And one of the provisions of the lawsuit is that we were being monitored for ensuring that children in foster care custody of the department were only placed in licensed homes, a licensed facility pursuant to an order of the court, or they could be placed with an unlicensed relative. Another reason was that our fictive kin, and just like Marina had said in the beginning, I'm going to continue referring as fictive kin, but in full transparency, in Michigan, they're not fictive kin, they're relatives, right? So we'll get there, but fictive kin were not eligible for maintenance and other case service payments without licensure. So what's important to know about that is at that time, when we were looking at this, our relative providers were all eligible for foster care maintenance payments. Those private agency partners that were managing those cases where the relatives were unlicensed were eligible for case service payments. So if we had fictive kin as separate, they would continue to not be eligible for payment. And that really had to do with some of the it had to do with the way the funds were appropriated when we were approved to pay our relatives. And then lastly, we had a state statute in place that said we could only place in a foster family home, group home, child caring institution, or in a relative home. So when we were looking at the updates, that was another statutory update that was going to have to be made. So when we considered all these factors, you know, we were like, the way to go for us is that we're just going to expand our existing definition of a relative. That's what we want to do. We thought it came with the most benefits. So we took the drafted language, we completed a legislative analysis. And some of you may be familiar with legislative analysis that you do in your own states, but just a quick description of what's included in that. Usually includes, at least in Michigan, what are all the proposed changes that you want to make? What are those statutes that are being updated? You have to give background information as to why you even want to make this statutory update. You have to cover any potential impacts on your current programs. And then for us, we have to provide arguments that are in support of the change. And then we have to also provide any arguments that may be in opposition. And so we were very in support of this and had significant research and policy updates that we could propose that we felt would dispel those concerns. So we don't just leave it with arguments in opposition, we kind of counter those as well. And then we gave our state's stakeholder position and address any revenue implications. So for us, there were going to be revenue implications associated with including those more fictive relationships in our relative definition. And again, that comes back to what I said a minute ago. It was because we were paying all of our relative providers a maintenance payment and our private agencies an admin payment. And so if we increased our relative definition, that was going to increase all those more fictive relationships that one, we could expand, or those that were considered unrelated caregivers with the placement currently would then fall into our relative care category, therefore increasing payments coming out of our general fund. So that was the fiscal impact for us. So after we did all of that, we then sent out a notice for consultation to our tribal partners. So we met with our tribes, and we were surprised to find out that they had significant concerns with our proposed changes to the statutory definitions. So let me just preface this with many of our tribes had their own definition of a relative, and it did include those fictive relationships. So it wasn't that they were not in support of fictive relationships. What they were concerned with was that the language changes that we were proposing were ultimately going to have a negative impact on ICWA, and they were concerned about the implications to MIFPA, so the Michigan Indian Family Preservation Act. So since our tribal partners had significant concerns, we reached out to our legal team. They completed legal research. They provided us with analysis. The quickest version of the analysis is that legal really didn't see that there would be an impact to ICWA based on our changes. However, let me rephrase. They didn't see there would be an impact to ICWA. However, tribes that did not have laws or customs that defined extended family, which some of them did not, there was the thought that perhaps our changes could affect the MIFPA placement preference. So at that point, we tried to do a variety of steps to work on that relationship and come to some type of an agreement on what statutory changes to pursue. So we reviewed that legal analysis with the tribes. We pointed out that our policy deferred to the tribe's definition. That was always our intent. We believed that we had other steps in place that would address their concerns. We completed research that included looking at the definition of relative, fictive kin in states with codified ICWA, where they had codified ICWA under their state laws, like Michigan had done. We worked with our legal team, came up with multiple versions of language updates. We had multiple meetings. They were really just not progressing. We weren't getting anywhere. So we took it to a smaller work group. We met with our tribal partners in that work group to try to craft some language that would address their concerns, but also still move forward with the intent of opening up our relative definition, which could benefit, we really truly believe all of our children in the system. Anyway, we also reached out to NICWA. The point of pointing all of that out is we were trying to do anything we could to validate their concerns and come up with a solution that would work for all involved. However, all of those steps really we couldn't come to any agreement. There was nothing at that point that we could propose that would result in support by our tribal partners. And so what I want everyone to kind of take from this is, there was a lot of distrust, quite frankly. And ultimately, I think I know the fact that we created the initial language, we completed a legislative analysis, and then reached out to our tribal partners to let them know and ask for feedback though not intended, was a terrible consequence, because it just furthered their distrust. So, it was very unfortunate for all of us, quite frankly. So at that point, we just kind of took a step back. We were not wanting to damage that relationship further. And we were going to, look at sort of revisiting this later and bringing in our tribal partners at the beginning. So that I think is a valuable lesson to keep in mind. So I just wanted to say, based on some of the conversations that we've had today, one thing that the tribes were particularly opposed to in our crafted language, our drafted language initially, is that we had, our definition also includes those like close, close family ties, it's a broad definition like we've all talked about, but we had a statement that indicated, and I can't find it in front of me, but the basic concept of it was that if you were the adopted parent of a sibling, you could also be considered a relative. And so they were very opposed to that. There was some cases that they were going through our legal system currently where they were appealing, where there were some adoptions made with non-tribal families. And so, you know, they had legitimate concerns that including that language in the definition could result in a child being placed with a non-tribal family when there may be tribal families available and ready to be placed or take placement, because we added that, and that it would essentially put everyone on the same playing field. So we did scrap that language early on and ultimately took it out of the language as we move forward. Okay, so moving along. So here is where we ended up getting to our statute being updated. So, you know, as I mentioned, we halted it from the department's end. We were going to kind of wait this out and try to do it right. And we had an outside advocacy organization that had close ties, or that continues, quite frankly, to have close ties with our legislature. And they were able to move this forward on their own. They reached out, they got a legislative sponsor for the bill change and really brought this back to the forefront. So it wasn't the department initiating it at this point, it was this outside organization. So they proposed some language, and they really did work closely with the department at that point to take into any considerations we had or concerns we had with their drafted language. They made changes. We made sure that they were well aware and had to do another legislative analysis and all of that about all the tribal concerns. And so we proposed language that we thought would meet the intent and really believe would not have an impact on MIFPA based on all of those previous conversations. So on October 7th of 2022, our governor signed into law 4 House bills, and they updated the definition of relative and related. In the statutes we updated were our Juvenile Code, Child Care Licensing Act, Adoption Code, and the Guardianship Assistance Act. So once that was done, we were able to have those fictive relationships included in our updated definition of a relative. So at that point, staff could assess adults who had a strong positive emotional tie or role in the child's life, or the parent's life if the child was an infant, as a relative placement. So by updating those statutes, in this again, I'm reiterating things I think that were already covered, but by updating those statutes, we were able to make sure that the definitions aligned within all of those areas, which they had not previously, and had resulted in some areas that made things more complicated. So really, what were the significant benefits for us by doing it this way? Let me first tell you that prior to those fictive kin being added into our definition, staff could not recommend placement with fictive kin, or what we actually refer to as unlicensed, unrelated providers. But the court had to order those placements. So staff could say, yes, I want to place with them, but they couldn't do it without a court order. And there were, quite frankly, some courts that weren't even willing to sign court orders into those homes. Because they required a court order, it ultimately meant that emergency placements may not have even been possible with those unrelated providers. And so when we did all these updates and we made fictive kin relatives, because again, we don't consider them fictive kin, they are relatives. And the way our definition is broken down, it has essentially 4 categories of what a relative may include. And those categories, one of the categories really captures those more fictive relationships. So when we expand,
so sorry. I don't want to cut you off. I want to make sure we have a few minutes for South Carolina to share their
Oh
story.
my gosh,
Sorry.
how long have I been going? I'm so sorry.
No, this has
Tina.
been incredible. It's so helpful, especially your transparency. I really want to applaud that. I think so often we hear the story of how this
Yes.
happened, and it was Schoolhouse Rock. And I think your story is very real and useful. So
Yeah, nope. So that's good. There were lots of benefits. I think most of them really have been covered today. So yeah, I'm sorry, South Carolina. Sorry, Marina. Thanks.
you're great. Casey and Melissa, how about we take the last 7 minutes, and if you would love to like to share your story of updating your definition, I think it'd be fun to hear how it, maybe not fun depending on the experience, but how it was different or the same as Michigan's. I think Melissa, you are on mute, and I know the mute button might be hidden. There we go.
Sorry, my computer is sometimes on Zoom calls acts up on me and doesn't want to unlock and everything. So with and Casey she apologized. She actually had to jump off. She had to get to court. So she had
That
to
happens. Yeah.
But what South Carolina did recently was we actually went in under our state statute and redefined. Basically, we did kin and fictive kin. And kin is anyone who's related by blood, marriage, or adoption. And fictive kin is anyone who is not related by blood, marriage, or adoption, but has a significant bond with either the family or the child. So thus, as we rolled out, basically when we rolled out Kin Gap, which we rolled it out, it got approved last year in May of last year by our state legislators, signed into law by our governor. The CB approved it in December. We rolled it out February 1st. I mean, that was the quickest we've ever rolled out a new permanency option. We use that definition of fictive kin to be able to consider our foster parents who have had our older youth for an extensive amount of time. And because our age of consent for adoption in the state is 14. So if I have like a 15-year-old who tells me I don't want to be adopted, and, and all that, but the foster parents, and he's been there 2 years and they're like, oh, he can stay with me forever. Or our APLA cases for our 16 and 17-year-old youth. And they've been in those homes and those foster parents are like, oh, we're going to stay. We use that definition of fictive kin to go back to them and say, well, we can offer you Kin Gap. We pay you a guardianship assistance payment, blah, blah, and go that route. We do have kinship licensing to where we offer non-safety waivers and we issue a provisional license up front. And it's for anyone who meets those two anywhere in that definition. We don't have a tool that defines third degree cousin, fourth degree, nothing like that. If mom comes in, her child enters care and she says, well, my best friend is Janie and I want my children to go, we consider that best friend as fictive kin. If a teacher comes forward and says, well, I've taught Johnny and I still tutor him after school and everything else, we'll consider them as fictive kin. So we've tried to make it as very broad so that the child and the family can list almost anyone or anyone that the child can come back to us and say, hey, I'm my best friend's mom is my second mom. So we use that throughout and we run with that. And it's been really well. We went from right before COVID, we were at like 7% licensed relatives or kinship foster homes. We're at 28% now. It doesn't seem like a huge increase, but it is a big increase when you had to shift. You shift TPR and adoption focus to we're going back and looking for relatives. We do search. We put in place before a child can go into what I call a stranger foster home. Our workers have to show their diligent efforts to find kin and have to have permission to place with non-kin, in that stranger's home and stuff. And
we're going to have you come back and talk about that at a future meeting because I think that's a really great practice to share.
Yeah, and and now with with the rollout of Kin Gap, it's been even more beneficial because our families and our kin, those that we defined as kin and these long-term foster parents now have more of a say in the case Because it used to be we didn't have that option. So it was either you take custody and guardianship of the child without any type of financial support, or we go to the route of terminating rights and you have to adopt. Well, grandma doesn't always want to become mom again. Grandma sometimes wants to be grandma, or aunt just wants to be aunt. Because if you've got a 3-year-old and, I can't say mom's not going to get her act together 10 years down the road. And why not let her have a chance to parent? And so it's a mindset we have to shift. But we rolled it out February 1st. We did our first one April 10th. And I mean, that was the biggest quick turnaround. We've got about 30. We're waiting on finalization of the guardianship going through now. We do the child and family team meetings where we bring them in, and it's for the first time, and they're telling us first time we are actually listening to them, and they're excited about it.
Yeah.
And some of them it's 4 years, 6 years within the foster care system. And I'm like, if in 4 years and 6 years we have not finalized an adoption, what are we waiting on? We're delaying that permanency on down. We are, there are things that we have found that we've got to tweak. And so there are some amendments to our regulations we're trying to get made this next legislative session. Some statutes. We are going to try to start using the approve that the feds say you can do instead of licensed. So it's a matter of how we define that. So that is in our work. We call that phase 2 on rolling out KinGap and really developing this. We've still got to look at our treatment cases or our family preservation cases, those that we don't have the legal custody of, but what do we do about those families? We know like there's certain things within the law with the background checks that, the federal government says certain felonies, you can look at the most recent 5 years, and then anything after that, you don't have to worry about. Our state law around that is very strict. And it says if you ever committed any of these type of felonies, you can never be a licensed foster home or adoptive home.
But maybe you can be an approved foster home.
Right. Well, it still even doesn't. We are
Okay.
trying to get that changed to align with the feds to where it gives us some leeway with relatives, with kin, so we can be able to give a little bit more options on that.
That's great. Well, I hope we can be of service to you as you're changing it. And I know you're working with Heidi, so you're in amazing.
They are. I mean, some of that I'm staying out of because some of that affects the licensing side of it and everything. I mean, I hear about it. I'm just like, okay, I'll keep up with it. But I handle all the KinGap stuff because I also handle all the adoption subsidy. So since the two go very similar,
Right.
I have it all here. But I mean, we've done a big change on it. The only thing we haven't implemented right now is that sibling piece. Like if grandma already had custody of 2 other kids and we place the other, we're not offering the guardianship assistance payment to those siblings that are not in our custody right now. We didn't take that into account when we did our financial,
Got it.
impact and everything. So, that I tell people we got probably about phase 3, phase 4 still to go, and we're slowly implementing it in. But as we roll it out, it's definitely been a learning experience. It's definitely been that mind shift. You don't always have to go for TPR, and you can now, with the way we've done our definitions, we have that outside of the box way of thinking for our, what I call our long stayers, those who've been in foster care for years and years and years, that adoption's really not an option for them. They don't want to be adopted. It gives that youth more of a voice, and those long-term foster parents who say, oh, they can stay with me to age out. Well, why do they need to age out? Let me offer you this. And so we are seeing a lot more in that too. We've got a lot more inquiries on it. So.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Amber and Manoush and Anna. This was frankly more content than I expected for this meeting. So that was pretty great. Please reach out if you need help extending your definition, reviewing the places where you've got relative defined, or as mentioned, if you have guidance or tools around saying this person counts as kin, and this is a framework tool we've got for our workers, or if you want to be involved in making such a tool, please reach out. And that sounds like a great thing we could do together as a community. So thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
All right.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.